A History of Role-Playing Games in 101 Objects, Chapter 9, 4th edition versus Pathfinder. Chapter 8, we looked at 3rd edition D&D, and in particular the open gaming license and the effect that had on the industry. And huge impact on the industry. Opinions changed, though, at Wizards of the Coast, and they decided to move away from the open gaming license. 2007 came around, and Wizards of the Coast announced 4th edition Dungeons and Dragons, which was not going to be produced under the terms of the open gaming license. It would be possible for third-party publishers to publish material for the forthcoming 4th edition, but under much less pleasant licensing terms as far as the third parties were concerned. And they didn't like it. So even before it started, really, 4th edition had lost some third-party publisher support, and this will become important. Now, in this history, I don't really want to get too much into role-playing game theory, because it can be quite a dull, tedious, academic, pseudish kind of subject. But it is sort of relevant to what Wizards of the Coast are trying to do with 4th edition in terms of style of play. You have to think what's happened by this point in wider gaming, not just tabletop gaming. By this point, massively multiplayer online computer role-playing games are becoming very popular. I suppose EverQuest was the first really popular one, and then massively more so World of Warcraft. And I think a lot of potential role players had never played Dungeons and Dragons or any other form of tabletop role-playing game, but were playing away in EverQuest and then World of Warcraft. And of course, those computer games and the non-online, the offline computer role-playing games, like nowadays we'd be familiar with things like Skyrim, but all those kind of games are thick with D&D tropes. You level up, you kill the monsters, and the monsters are things like orcs. And I think initially, certainly for me, and I suspect for most people, who were tabletop role players who saw these computer games coming out, we would assume that people who played them were, at the very least, familiar with tabletop role-playing games, and were probably people who had played tabletop role-playing games. But that's actually not true. Many people were playing World of Warcraft having never picked up a D20. I can give you a personal example of this from my own career. I used to do a little bit of university lecturing. I was a part-time university lecturer. I taught accounting, in fact, and it was useful having the shop. I had essentially a company of my own that I could use in examples when discussing accounting matters, or how to do the double entry for stock and so on. So in order to use my own company, I had to explain what it did, and I had to explain what tabletop role-playing games were. And I remember one girl in my class who had never heard of Dungeons and Dragons before. And okay, fair enough, not everybody has. But it later transpired, later in the term, that not only did she play World of Warcraft, that she had a level 60 character. So she was quite a hardcore World of Warcraft player. And I thought, the idea that you could get to be a hardcore World of Warcraft player without even having heard of Dungeons and Dragons struck me as bizarre. But I think it's probably not that rare. So essentially, Wizards of the Coast realised that there was this untapped market that they could, get off their computer screens and get around a table and get rolling dice. And I think actually that's quite a sensible idea. So I'm going to say something really controversial now. I hope you're sitting down. I might lose some geek credibility, but sit down and I'll explain. Dungeons and Dragons 4th edition is not a bad role-playing game. I can't believe you said that. No, straight up, listen, let me explain. If you set out to create a role-playing game, a brand new role-playing game that was designed to appeal to the sort of people who'd played EverQuest and World of Warcraft but had never played a tabletop role-playing game, and wanted to ease them in by using some very similar concepts and allowing them to do similar things with their pencil and paper characters that they could do with their on-screen characters, and it came out as 4th edition D&D, I think you would say that you probably succeeded. And I think people, if you scrub the Dungeons and Dragons name off, people who looked at 4th edition D&D in those terms would agree that they did a good job if that was their objective. So I'll say again, 4th edition Dungeons and Dragons is not a bad role-playing game. However, I don't think it's necessarily a good version of Dungeons and Dragons. It was very different to what had come before. Now, at this point, I'm going to get into some of the game theory stuff. Because another factor in development of 4th edition is a little bit of game theory, which comes to be called GNS theory, developed by a guy called Ron Edwards, who's an indie RPG developer. And I suppose, as a developer, quite an obscure one. His most notable game is Sorcerer. Funnily enough, we sold a copy of Sorcerer yesterday, but it's not a big selling game by any means. But he had much more of an impact on the industry and the design of role-playing games with his GNS theory. The idea, the G and the N and the S stand for gamist, narrativist, and simulation. And those are 3 strands of games and 3 types of players. So gamist people like to play a game. They like to win a game, and if you've ever seen somebody on an online forum asking for advice on the best build for their character, how they could choose the best special abilities and feats or whatever, or best mixture of classes and races to make their character the most powerful, that's somebody who's very much a gamist. Narrativist players are in there for the story. And they want to essentially develop a story with the help of the GM. Simulationist players want the game to be a simulation of real life as close as possible, or if not real life, then a particular scenario, a particular set of circumstances. So it might be that they want to play something which is a simulation of a fantasy world in something like the Middle Ages, but they want, within the context of that fantasy, they want things to be realistic. Now, one of Edwards's premises, if you like, with this theory, and I think it isn't actually a theory, it's almost a manifesto. He suggested that because there were 3 different types of players, he wanted 3 different types of things, that role-playing games that tried to cater for all of those 3 impulses, the G, the N, and the S, were doomed to fail. And that instead, games should focus on one of the 3, much more than the other 2. I mean, to some extent, you always have to have some combination of the 3. There's always a simulationist element, there's always a storytelling narrativist element, there's always a game element in any role-playing game. But he suggested that you should try and focus on one at the expense of the other 2, and if you try to please everybody, please all types of players at the same time, you were doomed to fail. And of course, traditionally, Dungeons and Dragons had tried to appeal to all 3 types of players. Go back to early days, I think probably Dungeons and Dragons, because it's derived from wargaming, is more simulationist in nature. And then as it develops, it becomes more gamist, I think 1st edition. And then at the end of 1st edition, through 2nd edition to 3rd edition, you get more storytelling narrativist elements. But it caters to all 3. 4th edition, because of that sort of computer gaming influence, and I think because the designers, and probably particularly Jonathan Tweet, knew what Ron Edwards was saying, definitely went more towards a gamist focus at the expense of narrativist and simulationist elements. So in 4th edition D&D, you very much it's very much based around moving miniatures on a grid. Every character tends to have a set special abilities that they can play, and there seems to be a more of a focus on optimizing the build of your character. And a lot of now, if you're not one of the gamist kind of players, if you're a simulationist or if you're a narrativist, then that means that 4th edition D&D is less to your liking than 3rd edition D&D. And I think that's a big part of why lots of people didn't like 4th edition. There are other reasons, I suspect, why people didn't like 4th edition. For one thing, I think there's a financial investment. 3 core rulebooks that come out are expensive, particularly if you only bought 3.5th edition, the version 3.5 edition rulebooks, I think probably 4 years previously. And of course, you maybe had a wealth of other material, probably stacked up to the ceiling, of 3rd edition and 3rd edition compatible stuff. And going out to a rule system which was quite a break from that, still sort of semi-compatible, but only just, meant getting rid of that stuff, and that's an obstacle to some people. If only there was another new role-playing game that was compatible with my big pile of 3rd edition. Well, there is. Come to that very, very shortly. Object number 77 we've got here. This is the 4th edition Player's Handbook. I'm going to have to show you a photograph because we don't have a copy in stock at the moment. And Object 78 is just as an illustration that there's some really good stuff produced for 4th edition that tends to get overlooked because it's become part of RPG geek culture to diss 4th edition instinctively. So people overlook the really good stuff. Object 78 is an adventure called Madness at Garmore Abbey, which should count as one of the great D&D adventures, and I think is overlooked because it's 4th edition. Incidentally, it's actually worth a little bit. Last time we had a copy, we sold for it was a 3-figure sum, I think, off the top of my head. It does sell because it's got this good reputation. And then there are other good 4th edition adventures. The rule system you don't have to use. One thing I think 4th edition does really well is when you have encounters, they tend to go in big in the description of the encounter with the tactics that the monsters will use. And it's tactics which sort of tend to be displayed as using miniatures. Not everybody plays with miniatures. For me, as a DM who always uses miniatures, that's great. And having, using a pre-prepared adventure where it tells you the tactics that the monsters might use is great. That is absolutely a mind saver for the DM who should be busy thinking of other things during the adventure. So I really like some of the 4th edition adventures, even if I've never used 4th edition rules. Like I said, it's become sort of geek culture, I think, to diss 4th edition rules. And I think the reason for that, 4th edition D&D is to D&D what the Star Wars prequel films are to Star Wars, or what Monopoly is to board games. It's, you establish your geek credibility in Star Wars by saying how terrible the prequels were, or you establish your geek credibility in board gaming circles by scoffing at people that play Monopoly, and you seemingly establish your geek credibility in role-playing game circles by dissing 4th edition D&D, and I think that's generally unfair. So yeah, sorry, I've never played it myself, I'll be honest, but I think there are good things. It's absolutely not what I want out of a role-playing game, but I think, I know people that run 4th edition and it's perfect for what they want. And if you've come from a video gaming background with no tabletop, then actually it's not a bad call to use 4th edition. Now, I mentioned the possibility, well, what if there was a role-playing game that was new, that was out, that was supported, but which was compatible with all my huge pile of 3rd edition? And that's Pathfinder. Now, Pathfinder was published by Paizo Publishing, which was one of those third-party publishers that produced a lot of material for 3rd edition. In fact, they'd taken up the license to produce the old TSR magazines Dragon and Dungeon. and did a really good job with those actually. The later Paizo Dragon magazines are excellent, and their dungeon magazines really good. If you're looking for good quality third edition adventures, find some copies of dungeon magazines from the Paizo era. Excellent stuff. Now Paizo had largely hitched to the third edition OGL D20 wagon, had seen the forthcoming fourth edition Apocalypse and wondered what they were going to do. And what they decided to do was, sod it, if that's going to be fourth edition D&D, let's produce our own version of D&D. We've still got the use of the OGL. We can take 3.5 edition D&D, make it better stroke different, and release it and give it our own look and feel and our own rulebooks. And that's what they did. The other innovation that they had when they did this was they sort of got game shops involved, they got gaming groups involved, and they had this massive public beta test of it. You could actually buy the beta test rulebook, which was the supposedly almost complete version of the rulebook, and it was sort of polished off after that. In fact, we have a copy here. This is Object 79. This is the original Pathfinder beta playtest rulebook. Now, softback, the final version was hardback. Single rulebook rather than a player's handbook, Dungeon Master's Guide, Monster Manual combination. Rather thinner than the final version. And Pathfinder was very successful. And I think it was successful for two reasons, one major, one minor. The major reason is that it was just people saw 4th edition D&D and thought, I don't really like the look of that, and it's completely incompatible with everything else I've bought for the last few years, whereas this is compatible with everything I've just bought for the last few years. Why don't I just play like Pathfinder? I mean, I dare say a lot of people also just stuck with playing with their 3rd edition and version 3.5 D&D rulebooks. Fine. But a lot of people who might have been tempted to switch to 4th edition switched to Pathfinder, or they tried 4th edition and went back, and rather go back to 3rd edition, went back to Pathfinder. The other minor thing I think which helped Pathfinder succeed is the concept of the adventure path. Now, Paizo had started this in Dungeon Magazine, the idea that there would be an adventure every month for generally about 6 months, and then they would tie together and they'd take the characters probably from 1st level to 10th or thereabouts over the course of 6 monthly adventures. And they started producing these commercially. So here is an example. This is number 10. This is from the Curse of the Crimson Throne adventure path. That's called A History of Ashes. This is adventure. This is part. Not actually sure which one it is, what number that is. This is early enough that although it's labelled Pathfinder Chronicles, it's still got the 3.5 OGL compatible. So early Pathfinder stuff it's designed, although it's badged Pathfinder, it's also designed to work with Dungeons and Dragons. In fact, Pathfinder existed just as a brand name before the role-playing game existed. And the quality's pretty good. It's full colour throughout. And reasonably attractively priced as well. This was less than $20 when it came out. Also, Pathfinder goes with a particular art style, I think it's fair to say, and for the most part, it's the same artist on most of the covers, a guy called Wayne Reynolds, a British artist. And I have to say, I'm not a fan. And I picked this particular adventure because this is everything that's wrong with Pathfinder art, in my opinion. We've got this it's very cartoony style. There's clearly some anime influences, not necessarily in the figures, but I mean, that sword is ridiculous, isn't it? I mean, okay, that clearly appeals to some people. That's not what I want in my fantasy role-playing games. Huge, ridiculous swords and spiky armour. Not for me. Didn't appeal to me. But Wayne Reynolds does pretty much all the Pathfinder art. The weird thing is he also does an awful lot of the 4th edition D&D books. So essentially Wayne Reynolds is, in terms of sales volume, is probably illustrating the majority of role-playing products that are sold, which is a bizarre concept. I don't think any other single artist has ever been had quite a hold on the industry, particularly an artist who, as I say, I'm not a huge fan of. What can you do? The other important thing about the adventure path and about Pathfinder in general, and it's not a good thing for people like me, for retailers, is the way that Paizo sold a lot of their material. They went in big on organised play. They had this thing called the Pathfinder Society, and you go and you play an organised campaign in your local game shop, perhaps, or wherever. And there would be regular Pathfinder Society meetups at conventions and so on. If you've ever been to a convention where there's a Pathfinder Society event going on, it seems that they just stay in that room all convention and they never come out. They never go and see anybody else. They don't talk to anybody else who isn't playing Pathfinder. They don't spend any money at the trade tables. And one of the reasons that Pathfinder players tend not to spend money at trade tables is because Paizo introduced this subscription model. So things like the adventure paths, you would subscribe to the adventure path subscription, and you'd pay a monthly fee, and they'd send you one whenever it came out. And there would be other subscriptions. So you'd subscribe to the Pathfinder flip mat subscription whenever a new flip mat, that's a dungeon terrain mat, comes out, that you get sent that, and I get the same with rulebooks. And it means that actually for retailers like me, we sell a lot less Pathfinder relative to its importance in the market compared to games like, say, Call of Cthulhu or Traveller. We sell a lot more Call of Cthulhu and Traveller than we do Pathfinder. Whereas if you look at amount of Pathfinder played or amount of Pathfinder sold totally, Pathfinder is much bigger than Traveller, certainly much bigger than Traveller, and up until recently was bigger than Call of Cthulhu. In fact, at the time we're talking about now, when it's Pathfinder versus 4th edition, for the very first time ever, Dungeons and Dragons is not the best-selling role-playing game. Pathfinder actually overtakes it and is the best-selling role-playing game around. And that's just some measure of just how commercially unsuccessful, or how commercially disappointing, I suppose, 4th edition D&D was. It's hard to call it unsuccessful when it was the second best-selling role-playing game on the planet, but when you've always been number one and all of a sudden you're number two, it's clearly a disappointment. Like I said, I think there was some good stuff produced for 4th edition, but it was just too different. So that although I think it actually came to as quite a good role-playing game, it's not a good version of Dungeons and Dragons. And I think that was its downfall. Now, in the next episode, that's chapter 10, we're going to call that the Age of Revolution. And we'll look at some things that really, really changed in the new millennium, really, really changed the way role-playing games were played and were sold and were talked about and were funded. Let's come to that next time. Until then, goodbye.